Well, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Chase. I'm a principal strategist here at JumpCloud, and I'm joined today by Jack Poller of the ESG group. And I'll actually hand it over to Jack, kind of describe a little bit more about your role and kind of what you do and operate in.
Well, thank you. It's great to be here, Chase. As you said, I'm Jack Poller. I am Enterprise Strategy Group's senior analyst covering both identity security and data security and the interplay between identity and access and data. Yep.
A handful kind of all those areas. So I'm excited to dive into the conversation we have with us and kind of start to look at, I think, too, just to kick us off with some background. I'd love to hear from you and kind of what are you hearing from your client base, kind of other changes that you might have seen within the last 6 months or so, and give us a good baseline.
Absolutely. I think it should be no surprise to anybody that, the economy is sort of front and center of everybody's mind. And I think that that's really, affected a lot of things. We're seeing, anecdotally, we see a lot of a lot of projects being delayed. People aren't canceling the projects, but they're being much more introspective and focused and really trying to dig in and understand their projects before they spend on them. So we've done research in the area, and our research says that roughly half of organizations will actually maintain or increase their IT spend, which is really good news. But like I said, they're being careful about it. If we sort of look at the different verticals, we see that, manufacturing and financials see the greatest increase in their IT spend, whereas healthcare and transportation will see the least amount of increase in spend. Now, no surprise as well that where's the money going? Well, cybersecurity is one area and artificial intelligence is the other. And sort of my perspective on cybersecurity is in economically hard times, the attackers, they don't get laid off. And in fact, a lot of laid off people may even be motivated to become attackers. And then, there's just this huge jump in interest in artificial intelligence, right? Obviously with ChatGPT and all of that. And then if we sort of think now, you and I are really thinking more about the identity space, right? And that's really what's important here. From an identity perspective, I think one of the big changes we've seen in the last 6 to 9 months is a change in attitude of the identity practitioners from identity being an IT operations problem to being much more a cybersecurity problem, where identity is really now finally being understood as being an atomic component of security.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think when you start to look at, what has the most keys to the castle, kind of where are the valuables within an organization, it's really the identity and what that identity can access within that, because it's no longer, a four-wall system, right? It's version across everything. And now you're trying to manage who has access to what and kind of all those different pieces when you're thinking about the proper modern identity structure in the context of there's ongoing security threats, there's all these other different macro pressures that you've kind of discussed and kind of thinking about all those elements. And so when you're thinking about, I'm curious from your perspective, how has organizations thought about kind of like cost consolidation in some of the areas to manage some of those burdens while maintaining, their security or improving their security practices?
The key word, I think, for this year is going to be operational efficiency. It really is. When we think about cost, we really think about operational efficiency. And obviously, the economic environment is one of the big drivers. And even though people are continuing to spend on IT, and in fact, sometimes with artificial intelligence, cybersecurity, increasing their spend, they're being very careful about it, as I said, and they're focusing on it. And a lot of that is because everybody's being told do more with less, right? So the idea is, how can we become more efficient so we require fewer tools or fewer people or better utilization of the people and the tools so that we can get better outcomes. So that's sort of one aspect. I think the other aspect really is the people part of it, right? And, I think everybody understands that cybersecurity people are very hard to find. And, At Enterprise Strategy Group, we've been doing a global IT spending intention survey for the last 15 years. And as part of that survey, we ask about where do you have a skills shortage? For the last 15 years, anywhere between 45 and 50% of organizations have told us they lack cybersecurity skills. And that's the number one answer really for where we lack skills. It's always cybersecurity. Very close behind that, 40% of organizations tell us that they don't have sufficient IT architecture and planning skills. And 38% of organizations tell us they don't have IT orchestration and automation skills, right? And that's part of how you achieve operational efficiency, is by thinking about these things, by planning out your architecture at a strategic level, and by orchestrating and automating things. So without those skills involved, it becomes a little bit harder to become operationally efficient. And so I think there's this big focus this year on those aspects.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think just to mimic, we're seeing a lot of the same things across our customers as well. So it's, hey, we're looking at AI, but it's not generating fancy photos or kind of updating avatars. It's really kind of like, hey, is there maybe perhaps a chatbot that we can help out internally? Are there other pieces that we can help become a little bit more operational within that, kind of leveraging the data that we have? Because I think prior, economy, it was a lot easier. Money was cheap. You could kind of throw people at the problem and say, okay, but now within a lot of organizations, kind of sitting with, okay, this is the team and this is kind of the tooling that I have. What are some of the changes that I need to make out? And it's doing more with less. It's how do we making sure that those tools are operating together? And that kind of brings to the next question, as we think about all these tools kind of coming to this convergence, how to make that happen. And so I'm curious, from your perspective, what are some of the friction points that you see within kind of a tool by tool kind of point solution base compared to perhaps like a platform approach where it's a little bit more all-in-one, a little bit more cohesive? Talk through a little bit about some of your observations there.
So there's a couple of aspects to this. And I think let's sort of start with some of the research that we have. And we ask in a lot of our research studies that question of, do you prefer point tools or do you prefer platforms? And roughly speaking, if you sort of think about across all the different IT domains, particularly in cybersecurity, the answers we get are typically 1/3 of organizations prefer point tools and 2/3 prefer platforms. So the question is, why do they prefer platforms? And if we go back and think about point tools, it really comes down to, if you're using a bunch of different tools, you as the company and organization and the head of IT or the head of cybersecurity have to develop your own tech stack. You have to stitch all the tools together and make them work together. And that's both challenging and hard, as well as it requires people who can do that. And that's part of the second part, is we don't have the people to do that, as we talked about. Now, when you're building your own stack, one of the things that helps you build that stack is standardization, right? And having standards for information interchange, so that one piece of the security stack or the IT stack or the identity stack is ready to hand off to the next piece in the stack. They don't have to have a translator in the middle. They have a standard way of talking to each other, but we're not at that stage yet in a lot of different areas of cybersecurity and identity, right? So that standardization is a problem. Now, a lot of the cybersecurity companies, the identity companies, the vendors are building ways for their tools to interact with other companies' tools, but it becomes what we sort of call a frenemy situation, where the tools and the companies are friends with each other in one sense, but they're also compete against each other because they have overlapping capabilities. So you get this situation where organizations that are building point tools want to have some level of interoperability, some level of standardization, but not enough that they can then be pulled out of the stack and easily replaced with somebody else. Right. So there's this sort of financial motivation to make it not as easy as it should be. So platforms really take all of those problems away and give a practitioner the ability to really just put something in place that covers multiple pieces of the tech stack and gives them the ability to get up and running without having to stitch it together. And as I said, if you don't have the people, then you it becomes much harder to build your own stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's an element in point in time of, well, we've, this solves a certain use case, and then we find another one, and then we, adopt a new technology, and you kind of create this layering effect over time. And for better or worse, right, you kind of have to stitch together, because this is the, IT blanket, if you will, that you got roped into. And there's very few moments in time where, macroeconomic pressures like this kind of serve as a forcing function to pick your head up and like, is there a better way, right? Can I have all these technologies within one approach versus kind of the current stitching that I have today? And within that, we kind of see this divergence a little bit, where platforms can either take a little bit more of a closed approach or a little bit more of an open approach. As you mentioned, kind of as you think about the frenemy situation as we walk into, I'm curious from your perspective, how does that affect an organization's ability to be a little bit more flexible in the future? And what are some of the elements that they should look for?
Well, I want to differentiate and make sure, because a lot of people confuse open and closed versus vendor lock-in, right? That an open platform won't have vendor lock-in, and there's a confusion between the two. And the classic example that sort of helps explain this is if we look in the PC world at Apple and Microsoft. So the Apple ecosystem is completely closed. If you buy an Apple computer, you cannot put non-Apple components in it, right? You can't open it up, you can't put Apple in it, and everything has to go through Apple and be approved, et cetera, versus in the Microsoft environment on Microsoft PCs, you can buy any component you want, stuff it in. You can build your own PC, you can buy pre-built, you can meet halfway in the middle. So that's sort of the open versus closed part of it. The vendor lock-in part comes in when you look at Apple. Well, you're locked into Apple, right? As soon as you buy into that ecosystem, you're locked in. You have to buy everything from Apple. If you're in the Microsoft PC world, you may be able to build your own PC, but you're still locked into how Microsoft says the world works. And then if you look into, well, if you're using Microsoft Office 365 for all of your stuff, that's your email platform, that's your communications platform, you're still locked into that environment and that suite, and interoperating with the Apple environment isn't as easy as it could be, right? So that's sort of that vendor lock-in part. Now, if we think about open platforms, the concept of open is really open should be open plus standardization. And when you have open plus standards, then it makes it very easy to treat components. In the hardware world, we have this concept of an FRU, a field replaceable unit. It's a component that you can just pull one out and put another one in. And with standards, you can put in an FRU, a field replaceable unit, from a different vendor. In software, we can do that if we have interoperability standards that say, how do we communicate between one platform and another, or one product and another, or one component and another. So the world has standardized after many years on a set of communication things that we think about today as the internet, but it's really called TCP/IP. It's been around for 40 years, and there's a whole standard body that ensures that it doesn't matter whether you're on Apple or Microsoft or Google, or you can build your own. As long as you can talk the correct syntax of TCP/IP, you can communicate with any other device anywhere in the world, and in fact out of this world, because now we have satellite communications and TCP/IP running, and we can talk to they use TCP/IP to talk to the lunar rover and all the other stuff, right? So that types of standardization makes it easier to then add and integrate and substitute your components. And if we sort of draw that whole conversation back into when we think about identity solutions and security solutions, when we have standards of communication, we have things like OIDC and SAML for authentication and authorization across the web. We now have FIDO, which is a standardized way of FIDO and WebAuthn. It's a standardized way of doing passwordless authentication, right? So if you have a solution that supports FIDO WebAuthn, you can connect that with anything else that supports FIDO WebAuthn, and you can use passwordless authentication to authenticate into any application, right? And so that's what makes it easy, and that gives, from the consumer, the practitioner point of view, choice and freedom into and not have that vendor lock in and be able to substitute one piece for another.
Absolutely. And I think you hit on a great point there, where as you start to think about different platforms, it's really the standardization, right? Kind of what are the acronyms, what are the protocols, what are some of those elements that allow organizations that flexibility? So no matter kind of what new technologies might come around, right? If we're all going to be on spatial computing headsets here soon, kind of whatever that might be, that you're also leveraging the same backend, and it allows for that flexibility. And it ties back into, say, the overall process of, your IT stack, your foundation, kind of how you operate in an organization, and each one of those processes that starts to hit, I'd say, both administrators and end users and anyone else in between alike. One of the elements that we've seen is kind of 3 different variables, if you will, kind of across some of the IT tooling, is kind of thinking about a little bit more about the process, is, the time to implement. So you can grab a new tool and say, hey, we have it. And now it's kind of and then there's the next phase of authorization and normalizations, making sure that, okay, we've started this thing, people are now aware of it, and then they can work within it. And then finally get to the point where, are you leveraging that tool set strategically? Is it maximizing your investment across the organization? And there's kind of those 3 phases there. From your experience in kind of working with your clients, where do you think most organizations tend to get tripped up when they start to look at the IT tooling process and kind of which one of those different phases?
Well, that's an interesting question, and the way I think about it is there's sort of deployment time. That's your first phase, right? There's time to value, right? It's time to, after you've deployed the tool, how long does it take for you to recognize some value? And then there's turning that value, going from regular value, I'd say, to sort of strategic value, and sort of that point in time value to longer term thinking and strategic thinking. Now, for all of these different stages, it's very much sort of tool or domain specific. So just to give an example, I was talking to a CISO recently, and they had a tool that they had put in place that after a year, they could not get the deployment complete, right? They were still struggling to put it in place and get it complete. So they ripped that out and they put in another tool, and they felt that after 6 months that the deployment was complete, and then now we're in that sort of time to value or operationalization phase, right? And they were getting value out of the tool, and they were done sort of with the configuration and all of that stuff, and they were using it on a daily basis. The same CISO in a different environment for a different type of tool put a tool in, and it took them 15 minutes to deploy the tool. They were up and running. And that tool had to go out and do some stuff, go across the cloud, find information. So they got value in about a week's worth of time, right? Mm-hmm. Now, part of that was the tools and how well the tools were built, and part of that difference between the 15 minutes 1 week and the 6 months or 1 year tools. Part of it was the type of tool it was and how well it was built, and part of it was the environment. For instance, if we look at identity governance, right? Traditional identity governance tools take a very long time to deploy, and then a longer time, another long block of time to sort of see value. When you're doing identity governance in a very large organization, part of that deployment time is really trying to figure out all the identities you have across your environment and to bring those into the tools so that you can do governance. And that just takes a long time. It's somewhat of a manual process, and it's part the tool, part the people, part the organization, right? Part of that is, and then it takes another long time to get value out of it, because you have to go and do reviews and say, hey, for this group of 100 or 200 people, do they have the right, do an access review, and do they have the correct permissions? And the tools, or the identity governance tools, are helping you do that, but it's a very hard and long process to go through. On the other hand, if we look at something like passwordless or multi-factor authentication, I talked to another CISO who had a customer-facing application that had 10 million customers in it. When they decided that they were having too many identity attacks, password hacks, and credential stuffing attacks, they decided they would go and make MFA mandatory. So they developed an MFA solution, they put it in place, they made MFA mandatory, and they saw value within 2 days. 98% reduction just in the number of attacks, not successful attacks, 98% reduction in the attacks they were facing simply by making MFA mandatory and the bad guys realizing that it's very hard to get around MFA, right? Now, those are sort of, we talked about sort of the first two phases, sort of that deployment phase and the time to value, time to operationalize. I think the real challenge for many organizations is to go to that third phase, which is what I would call a strategic phase, which is not just looking at that tool that you're deploying or that concept of MFA or IGA, identity governance, or that platform that you're deploying, but how do you think about it in a strategic perspective so that it does it becomes what I call a force multiplier. And this sort of gets back to the number of people we have and how do you build your technology environment in such a way that you're increasing your operational efficiency and reducing the resources required to do the tasks that you need to do, right? So the CISO I mentioned at the beginning who was struggling with this one-year tool and then they replaced with another tool, they had approximately 1,000 employees. They had customers. I think their customer base was somewhere around 15 or 20 million. And they only needed 6 people to run it's a financial services organization, and they only needed 6 people to run their entire security team, right? To do all of their internal security and the security for their 15, 20 million customers. So very efficient, and they were thinking about these things in a strategic way, right? And I think that's the challenge.
That's a great point, and especially when you think about that type of scale to that many people, right? Because typically you'd think within a financial services organization or kind of anything that's tied in around some a little bit more of a secure base, right? And it's not, I don't know, selling index cards or kind of anything else that would be, and it's much more tight, that you'd expand a proportional amount of IT security spend, whereas they took the different approach where it's a force multiplier, right? And I'm sure that they have systems that are working that allow each one of their team members to scale. They're operating, they're very efficient within that. And I think at that point in time too, it helps a little bit more on the people aspect, kind of coming back into what we started with is, hey, there's a skill shortage. We need more people to know all these things. But once you get to that point, you can then start to leverage it within a strategic fashion and allow people to grow a little bit more. And so you get to that type of phase. Does that make, hiring and I'd say the future professional development of those individuals a little bit harder or easier in mind? Because if you think about, they're probably managing maybe a couple different systems. Does that allow them to grow within their own careers a little bit faster and kind of help serve the community at large?
Yeah, well, I'll start with, hiring is hard no matter what you do. And hiring is hard across the board, whether you're hiring for cybersecurity or you're hiring for marketing or you're hiring legal staff, doesn't matter. Hiring is hard. And, I had a mentor who used to tell me that in a large public organization, it takes 6 months to hire somebody, 6 months to figure out if they're good or bad fit for the company. And if they're a bad fit, 6 months to a year to get rid of them because there's so much process involved, right? So if it takes, it takes you 6 to 18 months to figure it out and get rid of somebody, you better make sure you're hiring the right people. Invest a lot of time at the beginning. Now, that's especially true when we can't find people. It becomes very we have a tendency to say it's really hard to find somebody. I found somebody who fits the bill close. They're not perfect, right? Or maybe they're good but not good enough. But because I can't find anybody else, I'm going to compromise and take them anyway. That may, from a strategic level, from a tactical level, yeah, you hired a body and you can slot a body into your org chart and you can get some work done. From a strategic perspective, that may not be the right thing to do because if they're not a good fit for the company, and then it takes a while to get rid of them, and then you have to go start the process all over again, right? And then thinking about it strategically, right, and going back and thinking about what are we doing here? Are we building our own technology stack, or do we have a big enough platform that we don't have to stitch tools together? What's the talent that we need? If we're trying to hire somebody who can both run the tool, build the stack, and run the tools, that's sort of a different skill set than if we're trying to hire somebody who just runs the tools and has that some specialized knowledge. If we can't find those people, can we find people who we can train? And what's the investment in training those people, right? And then if we've now invested in somebody and training them, what's the risk that now they become more marketable and they want to go and find, put themselves out on the open market, right? So it's a very complex problem. Again, I think this is one of those areas where I like to think strategically about it and say, what's the goals of the company or the organization, the security team? What do we want to do? What skills do we have today? What skills do we need and supplement? And do we buy those skills or grow those skills, right? So do we hire a senior person who has all the skills we need and maybe they're more expensive? And they're also going to be in very high demand. So there's a risk that we hire somebody and they leave fairly quickly. Or do we hire somebody maybe earlier in their career and we train them and invest in them and sort of help them grow with us as a company and grow for the long term, right? So there's a lot of different ways to think about it. And some of it is company perspective, but I don't know any magic bullet to make hiring easier. Right, it's just a hard thing to do.
It is, and as you mentioned, there's a lot of context that comes within each individual organization and kind of how they treat different priorities, and even around, I'd say, the systems and tooling that they've adopted over time, right? And so you might have some folks that are trying to fill a gap because, hey, we bought this thing and we need a specialized person to run and operate it and kind of integrate it within the rest of our tool stack, as you mentioned, or taking the other approach where, hey, we might not need someone quite as specialized because the tooling and the platform that we've adopted allows it to be a little bit easier. It allows it to be kind of one of those areas where you're able to position certain folks throughout their career, but still leveraging some of those different technologies. And it doesn't force you into, well, now I need to be trained and certified in 5 different things. If you have a little bit more of a platform approach, then it's, well there's one tool, or there might be, multiple different feature sets within that. But the context and the familiarity is there. And more importantly, too, as things grow and you have your own career experiences, a lot of it's data driven. So making sure that all that data is actually within one area across spread multiple different areas, I think that adds to some of the different friction points that you might see, especially within, let's say, small, medium enterprises or kind of organizations that are starting to grow. And that's usually where you start to pick off your friction points. I think as you get into larger enterprises, well, it's a little bit more established, like you said, we've been trying to get rid of these people for 2 years, but they at least know the systems and then other elements that all come within that. So I guess one, just to take us off script a little bit here and rely on your knowledge base of kind of all the different elements that you've seen across the different organizations and other areas. I know that we've talked about, big security threats, economic, all sorts of that's causing havoc across organizations. But there are some bright spots, right, where they're maintaining or enhancing their security measures, they're kind of maintaining budget, at least to making sure that they have the people and the tooling in place right now to allow them to grow. From your perspective, what is one optimistic trend that you're seeing in the field, or perhaps we can also take another way is, what's another troubling area that you see across those? So perhaps we can look at from a dichotomy there of what's some other shiny bright spots that you're seeing that you'd like to share with the audience today, and then what are some other pieces to making sure that we're still up in arms. So.
Well, I'll start with the not shining bright spot, because I'd rather talk and sort of think about it at the end of ending on something very shiny, very positive, right? But artificial intelligence, right? And artificial intelligence has gotten a lot of press lately. And, you mentioned that earlier on in the conversation and thinking about chatbots. And, I'll pose the question to you. Have you ever interacted with a chatbot and come away with a good experience?
If I'm expecting, I'd say, tactical advice, right? And so within that, it'd be like, I need a recipe for tomato soup, right? And it's not something that, I could go grab it, but it's the time and ease. And I think those are some of those other, but the deeper existential questions, conversations that you'd have with, a partner or friend, it is a little lacking, I would say, in some of the experiences I've had.
Well, and we have a tendency, and I talked earlier about operational efficiency, right? And there's a tendency to say, hey, well, we have this chatbot. The chatbots can do all these things, so let's replace a human with a chatbot, right? And humans are very expensive, and chatbots can be very cheap, and great, okay, but chatbots and artificial intelligence in general, it's not magic pixie dust that you can sprinkle across your product and then all of a sudden your product solved everything, right? And particularly in cybersecurity, we have this tendency to say, let's plaster artificial intelligence across our product, right? We'll smear it across and say we do AI, and all of a sudden we have a silver bullet and we no longer have to worry about it because AI will do everything, right? And that's just not the case. And from an industry perspective, our industry is really bad about that, right? And it's also, I want to see transformative. I want to see AI being truly transformative, changing the way we do things, rather than just being an incremental, right? I want it evolutionary rather than revolutionary rather than evolutionary, right? And right now we're very much in just, hey, let's use the AI to make it a little bit easier. There's there's a lot of AI tools that help incident responders to go and investigate an incident and say, hey, I see this. Well, let me go, rather than the incident responder having to search for 20 different items and bring all this information together, the tool does it for you. And that's good. And that does increase operational efficiency, but it's not something that's really changing the game for the incident responder, right? We've been using artificial intelligence for years in the identity space and something called UEBA, user and entity behavioral analysis, which is a form of AI that we've been doing for quite a while. And it relies on the concept of we train the tool on a baseline behavior. And then once we understand what the baseline is, we look for anomalous behavior that's outside, away from the baseline, right? And that's all great in concept, except if your employees are already doing bad things and have bad behavior, then you train the tool on the baseline of bad behavior, and bad behavior is not anomalous, right? And so again, that AI it isn't a magic bullet that helps solve the problem. Now, I have seen some early product releases that are, that I've talked to a number of companies that are in development of things that are transformational. And, I'm waiting. I just want these things to become public so we can talk about them and we can get them out there and have, this real impact, right? I mean, if you think just in the general space about things like ChatGPT, right? And there's all this press about ChatGPT. But people don't understand what it is. It's a statistical model that basically looks at, here's a library of a bazillion words and how they appear next to each other. And based on what we see in that library, we predict that the next set of words will be this. So if you ask ChatGPT certain things, it's not giving you an answer. It's essentially lying to you because it's just coming up with new words. And there are many, many cases you can find that have finally been publicized where it will come up with, when you ask it for, let's say, a medical question, you say, give me the journal reference where this study is for this type of thing, rather than actually giving you medical, science literature articles. It creates those articles out of thin air because it knows what an article looks like. Right. So it essentially lies to you. It creates stuff because it's supposed to create text. That's what it does. Right. So, right. So that's sort of, I think this is a big problem when we're struggling with it. And there's a lot of other areas, but I don't want to spend too much time on AI. I think, like I said, it's the negative. Now, if I think about sort of what's, these really good positive things, I've talked about two of them in here, but I'll expand on both of them. And the first is passwordless authentication. Right. Look, from the moment computers were invented and we finally figured out that more than one person wanted to use a computer somewhere, we came up with this concept of a username and a password. And that worked that worked in the academic and the research community, and it worked when we had 1,000 computers. It worked when we had 1 million computers. But when we have 1 billion computers, it doesn't work, and we know it doesn't work, and we know there's a gazillion things wrong with passwords, right? We've put together a Band-Aid on passwords called multi-factor authentication, and basically it says, Passwords are basically proving you are who you are by having something you know, your password. It's a secret we know, and we share that. Right now we say, in order to prove we are who we say we are, we have something we know and something we have, a second device, right? Or something we are, a fingerprint or a voice print or a face, right? With passwordless, we get rid of the concept of the shared secret. And the shared secret part of it is what gets hacked by the bad guys, right? So now with certificate-based authentication, which is a form of passwordless, with FIDO, we're seeing, and I've declared early, late last year, early this year, I declared 2023 to be the year of passwordless. I still think it is. We're really starting to see passwordless come on strong. I'll have research data I'm releasing later this year that'll talk about this and shows there's a really big, strong interest in this, and it's really going to start solving a lot of the problems we have. So I think that's one really good sort of thing that's happening in our industry. And the second thing, which is sort of, I'll end with where I started, which is that the identity community is really starting to understand that identity is a cybersecurity issue, much more so than an IT operations issue. We now understand how to deal with, on the workforce level, a company with 100,000 or 200,000 or 1 million employees, we can manage those identities really easily. Now we have the tools in place. For customers, right, we have, Amazon has God knows how many millions and millions, and probably 1 billion customers, I don't know, but we figured out how to deal with that, right, to manage that volume, right? Now we have to say, really, cybersecurity, right? What is the attacker's ultimate goal, right? The attacker's ultimate goal is getting access to our data. And for most attackers, the way they get access to our data is through an identity. And that's why identity becomes it is the atomic component of cybersecurity. And we have to treat it as such, and we have to secure our identity infrastructure. We have to secure the identities. And that's why we have to go to passwordless, right, to secure the identities. And that realization and our, and I'll sort of also mention the other part of this is zero trust, right? And the zero trust concept basically says, rather than having this concept of a perimeter where anybody outside the perimeter is not trusted, anybody inside the perimeter is trusted, we say nobody is trusted, and you have to authenticate. You have to prove you are who you say you are, and you have to prove that you have to get authorization. You're allowed to do something before you do it, not just, hey, because you're in this spot in the network, you can do whatever you want to do, right? And again, that's based on an identity, and that's why identity is crucial here to understanding who is allowed to do what, who is allowed to access what. And it's a security issue. And this realization is really going to transform cybersecurity and make our organizations much more safe and secure.
I absolutely agree. And I appreciate you bringing those points up specifically because, one, I'm just as excited about passwordless because I think, as you mentioned, because identity, we are having this resurgence of how important it is within an organization as we start to operate business in 2023 and beyond in kind of this modern world. But passwordless is also this kind where it removes a lot of the friction from users as well. We've always had this notion where, well, if we want to make identity more secure, we want to do these things, it's more lock and key. There's other areas and hoops that users have to go through, which tends to skirt a lot of things and get people in trouble in the first place, right? Because they're trying to access other areas and get around all those different pieces just to get their goals done. And now the rise of multiple different technologies, again, leveraging the standards-based approach, offering organizations that freedom and flexibility, but also getting users a way to get in and get their work done, but then also doing it in a very secure manner, understanding that they can get into the right access points at the right time and nothing else, right? Only within that kind of guarded role to making sure that they're operationally efficient within their roles and it's not exceeding bounds and also causing security friction and other sorts of fun within that. Well, perfect. Well, thank you, Jack, for spending time with us, kind of walking through all of the different insights that you've had and kind of covered from the ESG. I'm excited to see future reports on passwordless and kind of where these trends start to go. So again, thank you so much for your time and audience for joining us today as we start to dive into these concepts. And as you look to dive in more, a lot of this is available within JumpCloud and making sure that you can operate within those different areas as well as additional research and reporting from the ESG group.
Well, thank you, Chase. It's been absolutely wonderful to be here, and thanks for allowing me to sort of express my views.
Absolutely. It's been an absolute pleasure. Well, thank you and have a great rest of the day, everyone, and we'll talk to you soon.
Please subscribe and check out more content from us.